when there are more severe downsides to screwing up, people just tend to screw up less.
Well, now we have This Week in Common Sense for the first week of September 2019, and you were on vacation, so I'm not sure you even remember what you wrote.
Right. It is kind of funny. It's like you need a vacation from the vacation. Boy, I just, let's just say I perspired a lot. It seemed like I hiked all the time. I played tennis all the time. It was so much fun. And I'm just completely exhausted. So I need like a week to recover. And that's par for the course. But I guess that's good somehow. It's kind of like with exercise. You don't know whether it's the exercise that makes you feel good when you're through, or whether it's being through that makes you feel good when you're through. There is something about a body at rest after really wanting to be at rest when you have to move. That's kind of the hiking is that way. It's like, it just is a little bit of like masochism or something. It's this suffering sure feels good.
I guess so. Well, at least no one called a dispatcher on you, which
Yes.
is something you wrote about for Friday today.
Yeah, and it was interesting because 911 audio was somewhat disturbing, and not in a necessarily the world's going to end type disturbing, but just the callousness, the idea that somehow, maybe while this woman is at least scared she's going to die, that it would be a good time to give her a good tongue lashing, or roll your eyes, or just be dismissive and kind of rude and condescending. And if you'd called somebody out of the blue, you thought you were calling 911, but you got somebody you didn't even know, you'd almost expect that they would handle the call a little bit better, a little more generously, a little more compassion. And of course, the fact that the woman's saying, hey, you're not going to die, get over it, stop freaking out, blah, 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 and berates her, or as the one television station said, yells at her, it's kind of bad enough until you realize that she did die. And so in her, final moments, and not because she drove into running water, but because where she was, the water came up and pushed her right off the road, from what we understand, or at least people who looked into it understand. And I started to make the point that we expect government to serve us. We pay money so that it will serve us, and and this woman was definitely not served. And so I really started to write that commentary with the idea that to talk about government and how government should be a servant, but just doesn't seem to be very interested in that role. They seem to be more interested in telling us what to do and in giving us tongue lashings. But then I stopped short of that. I really didn't do that. I think that's out there, and I think people have a sense of that, but that's not what I really touched on, and partly because this is one person. She doesn't necessarily represent everybody in government. She had resigned. This was her last shift. What can you do in a sense? They can't, she didn't do anything criminal. They can't fire her. She's already quit. And so I kind of thought it made more sense to make the broader point, which is true for all of us, that I think there are times where we get a little frustrated with people, and we kind of like to give them what for. And maybe this is a good lesson that, maybe just kind of percolating on that what for, on the recriminations that we could bring to bear on someone, on the tongue lashings, maybe just backing off on that on a regular basis and just helping people where we can help. We can't help, we can't help. But it just occurred to me that, when someone's in a pickle, you're berating them is just not really probably the right thing to do.
Yeah,
And especially, as I pointed out in the commentary, if you happen to be working for 911.
right. Manners is supposed to tell us that you don't do that to people, even if they deserve it in most cases. I mean, sometimes people do deserve a tongue lashing. Even then, you often hold back for a number
Yes.
of reasons. I mean,
You can always tell your friends or your spouse or your somebody later the tongue lashing you would have given that person, you know, and not give it. So it is, it is about manners in a sense, um, and expectations. And I think, we tend to feel like the world is becoming more coarse, and yet that may not exactly be the truth. It just sometimes seems that way, and this is certainly an example of that. Whether it's a trend or just another backsliding by someone.
so here's a question. Do you agree with me that 911 is the best government program that was enacted during our lifetime?
I've heard that comment made before. I've never had any qualms with it, if you know what I mean. You think for just a second, oh, now let me think, and nothing else comes to mind. I guess that, some people would say the Marshall Plan, which of course was, thankfully, we're old, but we're not that old. Uh, but I didn't see that as some great program. And, you could say winning World War II, well, that was before our time. uh, Losing Vietnam, probably not. Not the winning probably wouldn't have been better either. And so, yeah, I think it probably is. It's something that people use and count on. I mean, think about, and one of the neatest things that we have, this woman in that car, she first started to call, and I wasn't clear from a couple of different stories that I read whether she spoke to her aunt, I think it was, briefly, and then called 911, or started to call her aunt and decided, no, I better just quickly call 911. But if you think about it, when you and I were kids, if this same thing would have happened, that woman would have been alone on that highway. And even if they'd had a 911 or 911, a 911 service, it wouldn't have been available to people in their cars because there were no car phones, there were no mobile phones. And so the level of communication, so much greater, so much more immediate. And I've always looked at the cell phone as a safety uh, uh, matter. I wanted my kids to have one, as soon as they were kind of old enough that they were out on their own. It is a tremendous safety factor in terms of being able to reach somebody quick and let them know what's going on. And it's really sad, this particular case, but it is the kind of thing where that's something that, you could argue it could be privatized somehow. And I suspect if it were privatized, that the rigor by which, some of the training, just the when there are more severe downsides to screwing up, people just tend to screw up less. And when they do screw up, they tend to be replaced more quickly. And that maybe is a government private sector thing that would be worth talking about here. But I still think that my commentary. I mean, I'm always right. I think my commentary is the more important one, which is save that mean talking down to somebody for when they're not in trouble. In fact, maybe just save it for when they're not even there.
Uh, Save it for Twitter. Apparently,
Yeah.
that's what people do nowadays.
Twitter is, Facebook can be mean, but it takes a lot of time and lots of words and stuff to be more mean. Twitter seems to be like a, quick meanness. I can insult somebody in 140 characters. I don't need to go back and forth with them.
this week also started with the talk about the hurricane, basically. Was this a hurricane situation or was this some other situation?
Oh, this was no, this was it was a couple weeks ago. It was Fort Smith, Arkansas, and it was flooding from rains and so on. But I don't believe it had any connection to any hurricane.
Okay.
It was just flash flood, and it's interesting that when you talk to people about natural disasters, flooding isn't what comes to mind, and of course, it's always been the natural disaster that kills the most people. When there's a hurricane, what most people tend to die from is the flooding that happens, and especially, these flash floods where you may be in an area that doesn't usually get flooded, but all of a sudden does because some stream gets overloaded, some levee breaks, what have you,
Right.
and it's a pretty serious deal. And of course, the woman deciding to berate her about driving into the water, and it appears that she did not drive into running water or even standing water, that the water enveloped her. But that is a good thing to avoid. That people tend to think, well, I've been down this road a bunch of times. There's a little bit of water on it. I think I've probably done that myself, and maybe been right. Oh, it's only a few inches of water, and you drive right through. But sometimes you miscalculate, and it's not a few inches; it's a few feet, and your car's no longer on the ground under the water. It's floating on top of the water or being pushed by the water. So.